How good have you been at submitting to the rules during the pandemic? I heard one statistic, which I think was that 75% of people think that they have followed the rules better than other people. Now, if you think about it, if we all had an accurate perception of things, then the statistics should be exactly 50%. So perhaps we tend to have a higher view of ourselves or a lower view of other people than we should, or maybe even it's both. We're just beginning a fire break here in Wales. That's what the Welsh Government have called this 16-day lockdown of Wales in order to try and take action on this virus in anticipation of a coming spike. So for 16 days, businesses, gyms, shops, secondary school and places of worship are all closed. For 16 days, we're not permitted to meet others or to travel anywhere except for a few exceptions. Now, we're all likely to have different views on that. Some will accept that this is wise action and agree that this is the right thing to do at this time. Others will disagree and think that it's unfair and limits our freedom. Whether people are going to obey, well, that remains to be seen. Now, whether or not you agree, how good are you at submitting to those in authority, to the rules that they put in place, whether it's government, places of work or schools? Well, as Christians, we're instructed to do so. Even if we disagree, we're still to do so. As long as it doesn't cause us to disobey God, we are to submit to those in authority as Christians. But why? Why would Christians submit even to those in authority that they disagree with? Well, we're going through the narrative of Jacob at the moment, and although this part that we're looking at is not talking about submitting to human authorities, it does give us one of the reasons that Christians are to submit to those in authority over us, and it is about submission to the authority that is God. We'll come back to all that at the end, but for now, let's dive in on the story. It begins with issues about marriage. Back at the end of chapter 26, there are a couple of verses about who Esau has married. He's taken 2 wives, both of them are Hittites. Now, the problem with that is that they are people from the land of Canaan. They're sinful idol worshippers. But for the family that God has chosen to be his line of promise, they are supposed to be a distinct people from the people of this land, and they're certainly not supposed to worship idols. They're not supposed to just fit in, but they're to stand out from the people around them. And one way of doing that is by being careful about who you marry. It's very important who you marry. It's intended to be a lifelong commitment, so it's a big decision, and the influence about a spouse has over you is incredible. And that's why for Christians, we are only to pursue marriage with someone else who is a Christian. That idea gets repeated throughout Genesis and throughout the Bible, that God's people are not to intermarry with the people of the land, the people of the world, but are to marry among the people of God. Now, back to chapter 28 that we're looking at, as Isaac is sending Jacob away, so he instructs him not to marry someone from the land and risk compromise, but to marry someone from their family line. So as he blesses him, wishing him fruitfulness, descendants and possession of this land, so Jacob is sent off, he complies, he goes off to find a wife from among his ancestors' family. Now Jacob here is showing willingness to submit to covenant requirements. He's showing that if this is what is required of him in being the people of promise, then he is willing to do it. What about Esau? Well, as we've said, he has already married wives that were displeasing to his parents. He knows it. And he sees Jacob in his willingness to comply and marry appropriately. He sees that brings his parents pleasure. And so Esau goes off and gets married again. This time he marries someone from the Ishmaelites. Now, I wonder if Esau is actually trying to earn back his parents' favour at this point. After all, Ishmael was his uncle, and therefore this new wife was his cousin. Now, whatever we make of that today, it seems like at least he was trying to do the right thing. But trying to do the right thing and actually doing the right thing are not the same. You see, Ishmael has clearly been shown at this point not to be the line of promise. So even if from good intentions, he's marrying outside the people God intended to be the line of promise. It's a further demonstration that Esau is not going to be the line of promise. It may still be, though, that he is trying to defy his parents still. It may be that he's still trying to antagonize his parents. After all, he's not even asking them. He's not going to the descendants that Jacob has been sent to back in Padan Aram. Well, either way, whatever the case with Esau, whatever his intentions, that is, Jacob shows some form of willingness to submit to obligations, the kind of obligations that a covenant relationship brings, as we'll come on to. So he travels on. He goes off to get to his mother's family and find a wife. And as he's journeying, he reaches a place where he spends the night. And in that night, he has a crazy dream. He sees a stairway that goes all the way up to heaven. There are angels coming down from that stairway and going up on that stairway into heaven. They are God's messengers, and they use this stairway as a means of getting their orders from God and then carrying them out on the earth. But the big point here is that Jacob is given a moment of access to God in heaven. And the message he is given is the crucial thing. Let's see that from verse 13 in your Bibles. I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So far in the story, Jacob's mum has been given an indication that Jacob would be the son to be the line of promise. And as he's snatched at the heels of Esau to take the birthright and the blessing, so that would indicate him to be the line of promise. We've also had Isaac, his father, pronouncing God's blessing upon him, which includes elements of the promise that was given to Abraham. But in these verses, where God speaks directly to Jacob, as explicitly as it could be said, so God is taking the promises that were made to Abraham and applying it directly to Jacob. So here God introduces himself with his special name, Yahweh, which we translate as Lord with capitals. He is the God of Abraham and Isaac, as he reminds Jacob. He promises to give him this special land. He promises that his descendants will be like the dust, as numerous as the dust. He promises that all nations are going to benefit from him and from his line. He promises that his presence will go with Jacob and his protection. So all of these elements that were originally promised to Abraham, they're now taken up by Jacob as God explicitly applies them to him. So as clearly as possible, it has gone from Abraham to Isaac and now to Jacob. In this dream, he has become the recipient of this line of promise. But why does all this matter? Why are we talking about promises made by God to a certain individual 4,000 years ago, roughly, about a patch of land in the Middle East? Why does it all matter? Well, it's important because these promises, they still stand today. And it's important because this line of promise has culminated in Jesus himself. He is the supreme descendant of Abraham, who will bring to his people. He will bring them not just to a small country, but to the whole earth as their inheritance to take possession of. He extends God's blessing to all who will come to him from all nations. And as numerous as the people of God already are in Jesus, that is increasing as the numbers of those that follow Jesus continue to grow. He is truly bringing international blessing even today as his message reaches beyond any ethnicity. He makes us able to be the people of God who have his presence with him, who have his spirit living within us, and who receive his protection. This matters because if we are Christians, we are the fulfillment already of these promises. Only partly so, because there is still so much more to come. But if you're a Christian, then this is like you're looking at your own family history, but a history that includes an inheritance, promises for the future, and it shapes the way that you live today. It's not just about the past, see, it's about our current identity, about what defines us now. It's about us being a part of the covenant relationship in Jesus, part of that global blessing, part of the numerous descendants. So all of those promises of protection and blessing and presence and land, they are all yours if you're a Christian. What's more, this matters because it's for everyone. As we've said, the scope of inclusion for this promise is to everyone. Not everyone receives it, but everyone is welcome to do so. If you're not a Christian, you can come under these promises in Jesus as they've reached their culmination in him. And if you are a Christian, since this promise is for international blessing for all people, well, you get the privilege of taking that blessing to others. And it is a blessing and a privilege. We so often think of sharing the message of Jesus as daunting or scary, but it's simply inviting people to be a part of this blessing, be a part of this good thing. Well, Jacob wakes up from his dream. He realizes that it was at this place where he met with God. And he marks it with a stone, anointing it with oil, naming it the house of God, Bethel. And he's in awe of what he has heard. He recognizes how kind he is and how privileged he is to have had this encounter with God in this way. And then he makes this vow. It's there in verse 20. If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. So Jacob says, if God will be with him and provide for him and bring him home, then he will be one of his worshippers, and he will give to God a tenth of all that God gives to him. Now we could understand this as Jacob doing a bargain with God. And many people do bargain with God. Years ago, for example, there was a man called Martin. He was travelling in a storm at night, and a lightning bolt almost hit him. He panicked, and he asked for God's help to protect him, vowing that if he survived, he would become a monk. He did survive, and he did become a monk. He then was able to study the Bible in great detail, and he, as a result, became a true Christian, understanding his sin and understanding that the only solution for his sin was to be freely forgiven by God. His full name was Martin Luther. You may have heard of him. But is that the kind of thing that is going on here? Is Jacob bargaining with God, saying to God that if he does these things for him, then he will submit to him as God? If it is that, Well, it's not a pattern for us to follow. It's not right for us to bargain with God. But it does show that even if we have an immature faith that does try and bargain with God, well, he may still choose to bless us in the way that we've bargained, just as he did with Martin Luther, who God used to bring many people to a true understanding of the faith. But I'm not convinced that this is a bargain that Jacob is doing. Think about the word if. It can also be used with the idea or emphasis of since, and that depends on whether the if factor has been revealed already or not by the other party. Here's what I mean. God has already revealed to Jacob that he will be with him, that he will provide for him, that he will bring him back to this place. God has freely said to him of his kindness that he will do these things. So when Jacob says if, what I believe he means is, since you, God, as you have said, will be with me, you'll provide for me and bring me home, then as that does happen, so I will therefore be one of your worshippers and will give back to you 1/10 of all that you provide me with. So I don't see this as a bargain, but as a response to God's promise. When we as Christians today, when we recognise that God has caught us up in his Son and made us to be his own children, that he's blessed us with every spiritual blessing in Jesus, well, our response will be very similar. We will give ourselves over to be his worshippers, and will be willing to give back to him from what he gives to us. One means of which is by actually giving financially to the work of the church and the work of Christian ministry around the world. Some Christians even use the idea of 1/10 as a way of working out how much they're going to give to God. Now, I don't think we're bound by a certain percentage, but we are encouraged to be generous. So Jacob, in recognizing God, in recognizing God's kindness to him, he responds by submitting to him, by having him as his God, and even responding in worship by giving back to God from what God will give to Jacob. Now, what does all this have to do with where we started? Well, quite simply, we as Christians submit to others in authority over us because we first submit to God. Jacob recognized that God had shown him such kindness, and so he was willing to follow him, willing to follow God's ways, even at cost to himself. And he'd already shown himself willing to follow obligations of a relationship. The same is true of the Christian. If that's us, then we have recognized God's kindness to us in Jesus. He is the ultimate Son of promise, and he has brought us into that covenant relationship with God himself. And in response, we've submitted to him. We've called him our God. We've said that we're willing to follow his ways, even if it costs us. We're willing to follow the obligations of our relationship to him. And part of those obligations are to submit to those in authority over us. Because we recognize God's kindness to us in Jesus, that he forgives our sin and makes us his children, we're therefore willing to do whatever he asks us to do, even if it means submitting to those that he's put in authority over us, and even when we disagree with them. Think about it further. Jacob had to trust God that he knew exactly what he was doing, even though Jacob himself didn't know all of God's plans. And we have the same challenge today. Whether it's with those in authority over us, that we just don't know what they're doing necessarily, or whether it's just with this whole pandemic as it rumbles on, as we just can't figure out what is going on. Why is God allowing this to happen? Why is this going on? Well, what we can affirm is that God is still sovereign. He still knows what he's doing. And even though we may not, we're still to submit to him and follow his ways and follow his directions for us, even including following those in authority over us and submitting to them. Why? Well, because he has been kind and brought us into relationship with himself, out of nothing we deserve, but purely of his grace. And therefore, we submit to him and follow his ways. Well, let's sing a song that may help us to think on these things and ponder them further. Let's sing.